When you leave the Amish, you don't just leave a place. You leave an entire structure of meaning. You leave the framework that told you who you were, what you were supposed to want, how you were supposed to move through the world. And what happens next is that everything you thought you knew about reality starts to crack. My name is Hannah. I left the Old Order Amish community in Holmes County, Ohio, when I was 27 years old. I have spent the years since then trying to reconstruct my understanding of almost everything. This video is about that process, and about the things that shocked me the most when I realized how much of what I believed wasn't actually true. Let me start with something simple. I grew up believing that the outside world was evil. Not that there was evil in the outside world. That the outside world itself was evil. English people. That's what we called non-Amish people. Were fundamentally different from us. They were lost. They were corrupt. They were living in sin, and their lives were empty and hollow and desperate, even if they didn't know it yet. I was taught this so thoroughly that it became invisible to me. It wasn't a belief I held. It was the ground I stood on. It was just the way things were. When I left, the first thing that happened was I met an English person who was kind, and then another one, and then another one. And I realized that the framework I'd been given was a lie. Not that every English person was good. That wasn't the revelation. The revelation was that goodness and evil didn't track with whether you were Amish or English. People were complicated. They were kind and selfish and confused and brave and afraid, regardless of what community they belonged to. That seems like a small thing, but it wasn't. Because if that framework was wrong, what else was wrong? And I started pulling at the threads, and the whole tapestry started to unravel. I had been taught that women were naturally suited to certain kinds of work and men to others. That a woman's role was to be a helpmate to her husband, to manage the home and the children, to submit to authority. I had been taught that this wasn't oppressive, that this was the natural order, that this was what God wanted. I had been taught that wanting something different was wanting something selfish and sinful. When I left, I got a job. And then I got another job. And then I realized I could do anything. Not that I could do anything well, but that there was no category of work that was forbidden to me simply because I was a woman. I could work in construction or accounting or education or medicine. I could make decisions. I could earn money. I could have authority over other people. I could fail and try again. But here's the thing that really messed with my head. When I realized I could do these things, I also realized that I had internalized the belief that I shouldn't want to do them. I had internalized the belief that ambition in a woman was a character flaw. I had internalized the belief that my desires and my abilities were less important than my obedience. So leaving the Amish wasn't just about leaving a physical place. It was about unlearning every message I'd ever been given about who I was allowed to be. I was taught that pleasure was dangerous, that wanting things for yourself was selfish, that your body was something to be ashamed of, something to be hidden and contained, that your sexuality existed only to serve your husband's needs, that saying no was not an option. When I left, I had to learn that pleasure wasn't dangerous, that wanting things for yourself wasn't selfish, that my body was mine, that I got to decide what happened to it. But unlearning those things meant confronting how thoroughly I had been taught to hate myself. It meant realizing that every time I felt guilt or shame about my own desires, that guilt and shame wasn't coming from my conscience. It was coming from a specific system designed to keep me compliant. I was taught that there was one right way to live. And because there was one right way to live, that meant there were infinite wrong ways. And most people in the world were living the wrong way. This created a constant state of moral anxiety. Every choice was either right or wrong. There was no middle ground. There was no nuance. There was no grace for being confused or uncertain or changing your mind. When I left, I realized that the world was full of people making different choices and living good lives. People who didn't believe in God, or believed in God differently, were still capable of love and integrity and courage. People who made choices I would never make were still worthy of respect. And that changed everything about how I understood myself. Because it meant that the person I had been taught to hate, the version of myself that wanted things, that disagreed, that questioned, that version of myself was allowed to exist. I was taught that education beyond a certain point was unnecessary for women. We learned what we needed to know to run a household and raise children. Anything beyond that was prideful, was putting yourself above your station. So I read in secret. I learned in hidden ways. And when I left, I went to school. I read books. I took classes. I realized how much I had been taught to be small in my own mind. But more than that, I realized that the restriction of information had been intentional. That keeping women ignorant wasn't an accident of tradition. It was a way of ensuring that we didn't have the tools to question the system that was controlling us. I was taught that doubt was a sin. That if you questioned what you were told by your parents, your bishop, your church, you were acting in pride. You were putting your own judgment above God's authority. You were risking your salvation. When I left, I realized that doubt was actually how you learned the truth. Doubt was how you figured out what was real and what you'd been told was real. Doubt was how you became an actual person instead of just following a script. But the cost of that doubt was enormous, because leaving meant losing my family. It meant losing the community I had known my entire life. It meant being shunned, literally cut off from anyone I had ever loved. It meant being alone in a way I had never experienced. I had been taught that shunning was a tool of love, a way of encouraging someone to come back to the faith. When I actually experienced it, I realized it was a tool of control and punishment. It was a way of saying, if you leave, you will lose everything. If you question, you will be erased. But it was also effective. Because even though I left, even though I understood intellectually that shunning was unjust, I still felt the weight of it. I still felt like I had done something terrible by leaving. I still felt like maybe I was the problem. And I realized that this was the genius of the system. It had convinced me that my desire for freedom was a character flaw. When I left the Amish, I had to learn how to be a person. I had to learn to make decisions. I had to learn to trust my own judgment. I had to learn to want things and pursue them without immediately feeling guilty. I had to learn that I wasn't responsible for anyone else's emotional state. I had to learn that no one could control my body but me. I had to learn that I could change my mind. I had to learn that being uncertain wasn't a moral failing. I had to learn that love could exist without control. That family could exist without obligation. That belief could exist without blind obedience. I had to learn that the version of myself I had been taught was shameful and selfish and sinful. That version of myself was actually just a person trying to survive inside a system that wasn't built for her to survive. One of the strangest things about leaving was realizing how many of my thoughts had been given to me, how many of my beliefs weren't actually my beliefs. I would be going about my day and suddenly think something, and then realize, that's not what I think. That's what I was told to think. It's like someone had written a script and put me in it, and for 27 years, I had performed that script so well that I forgot I was performing. I forgot that I was supposed to be a character. When I left, I had to start figuring out who I actually was underneath the performance. And that process is still happening. It's been years, and I'm still unlearning things. I'm still realizing ways that the system shaped me. I'm still discovering things about myself that I had hidden even from myself. I was taught that leaving would be the worst thing that could happen to me, that I would be lost and empty and alone forever. And in some ways, I was. The grief of losing my family, of losing the community, of losing the structure that had held my entire life together. That grief was real. And it still is. But I was also given something. I was given myself. I was given the chance to figure out who I actually wanted to be. I was given the freedom to make choices, even bad ones. I was given the right to my own life. I think about the girls still in the community. I think about the ones who are starting to question, who are starting to wonder if there's another way to live. I think about the ones who are feeling trapped, who are realizing that the life they're supposed to want isn't the life they actually want. And I want to tell them, you don't have to stay. There is another way to live. It's terrifying and it's lonely and it will cost you things that are precious. But you also get to be a person. You get to figure out who you are. You get to want things and pursue them. You get to be wrong and change and grow. Leaving the Amish changed everything I thought I knew. It changed what I thought was true about the world. It changed what I thought was true about people. It changed what I thought was true about God and faith and community and love. But most importantly, it changed what I thought was true about myself. And that's the change that mattered most. If you grew up in a system that told you who to be, and you're starting to question that, I see you. If you're realizing that the things you were taught might not be true, I see you. If you're thinking about leaving, I see you. And I want you to know that there is a version of yourself on the other side of that fear. It's worth meeting her. This is my story. If this resonated with you, if you grew up having to unlearn everything you thought you knew, tell me in the comments. And subscribe if you want to keep hearing the truth from behind the prayer cap.